DEC Alpha, one of the most powerful chips available at the time that it was released, and lies at the heart of the little beast that you can see in front of you. Made by DEC, who at that time were the second largest computer company in the world, and who unfortunately a few years later would soon disappear. Not like PCBWay though, no, it's still alive, well, making PCBs and sponsoring videos, just like this one. Seamless segue. In this video, we're going to have a look at this Alpha workstation and delve into the history of DEC and see how they came up with this wonderful CPU. Now, some of you have watched videos from this channel before, but thinking, I'm sure he's done DEC before. And you'd be right, I have, yeah. I mean, we did a video about DEC all the way up to the PDP-11 in the 1970s. Well, today we're going to pick up from where we left off in the 70s and get all the way to Alpha. In the 70s, DEC had reached newfound levels of success with their PDP-11 range. But DEC were well aware of some of the shortcomings in that platform. Namely that it was an 8-bit platform with limited memory addressing. I mean, not as limited as you'd think for an 8-bit machine, but limited nonetheless. So DEC set up a project under the leadership of Gordon Bell, one of its more experienced engineers. In fact, Gordon was one of DEC's earliest employees, and was responsible for designing the I/O subsystem in the PDP-1, and of course the first ever serial UART, I think we still actually use today. He'd also been the main architect on the PDP-4 and PDP-6. And after having left DEC to go work at Carnegie Mellon University to teach computer science, he'd recently returned, and was now Vice President of Engineering, and, more importantly for the future of DEC, the head of the VAX project. With badge number 80 Gordon Bell in charge, he quickly pulled together a group of 6 people known as VAX A, named after the mailing list that they used to discuss these things, and appointed Bill Strecker as the chief architect. They decided what they wanted was a very PDP-11 compatible machine. After all, for their new platform it'd be a huge leg up to be able to run all the existing PDP-11 software. And to emphasize that fact, they soon decided that they called the machine VAX 11 to emphasize its PDP-11 compatibility. One of the big differences for the VAX platform over the PDP-11 was, for VAX they intended to have one operating system, rather than the 700,000 that they had for the PDP-11. I mean, there were a lot of operating systems for that thing. And thus Dave Cutler was put in charge of their operating system project, later to be known as VMS. That name might be familiar for all you Windows NT fans out there, because Dave Cutler was the person who created Windows NT after he left DEC. Now, I'm not going to spend too much more time on the history of the creation of VAX, because we really do want to get to Alpha at some point, and trust me, we need this VAX stuff to explain that. By October of 1977, the VAX 11 was released to the public, and it's fair to say, VAX was successful. In fact, VAX was incredibly successful. The VAX platform was embraced by lots of large corporate institutions, banks, financial houses, insurance companies, you name it. This period where VAX takes off, you can think of as DEC's golden age. This is where they made more money than at any other time in DEC's history. Of course, if you think VAX sold as individual machines pretty well, come 1983, DEC had an idea that would help them sell even more VAX machines, the VAX Cluster. The VAX Cluster was a really nice idea. You took essentially a number of standard VAX machines, and you connected a number of disks to them using a shared disk bus. So, each VAX machine would have access to the same file storage as all the others, meaning that a file system could be mounted on all of the VAX machines in the cluster, thus they could all work on the same data. This meant that if, for example, a bank wanted to process more data, well, it could add more VAX machines to the cluster. It also gave you some redundancy as well, as you could move all the workload off one individual machine, shut it down, do whatever maintenance you needed to do, and then bring it back up again into the cluster. This also handily gave DEC a way of selling free machines where one would have been sold before, which was pretty handy for DEC because although VAX is very successful, you don't sell a lot of VAX machines. It's not like people have one under each desk. This thing is not a microcomputer. In fact, talking of things not being a microcomputer, let's discuss DEC's bread and butter, terminals. As I mentioned before, both the VAX and the PDP-11 are not really the sort of machines you have at your desk. They're pretty physically, big. Everyone who accessed either of those two ranges of machines did so using a dumb terminal, essentially a serial device with a screen, keyboard that connects up to the machine and you log in via that. So for each VAX PDP-11, there's a number of terminals connected to it, each terminal with a different user sat at it. So terminals became the bread and butter of DEC sales, because for every one machine sold, there are a lot more terminals sold, and DEC had quite the range of terminals. Starting with their VT100, which effectively became the standard terminals that, other terminals would emulate. In fact, even today, when you remotely log into a Unix box or Linux box, yeah, you're running a terminal emulator, and that thing pretty much is usually either emulating VT100 or DEC's later VT220 standard, while there were other terminal manufacturers whose equipment again was compatible with DEC's machines, like Wise for example. Other terminal vendors do exist. DEC's home terminals did sell tremendously well, and they are pretty good terminals. Now, these dumb terminals, they're pretty much text-only affairs, and I say pretty much, and I'm going to point out how they're not quite before certain people come for me in the comments section. DEC did actually introduce two graphic standards for their terminals. First, there was ReGIS, which stands for Remote Graphic Instruction Set, which essentially let you do vector graphics on these terminals. Very simple vector graphics, essentially so you could do line charts and stuff like that. That was introduced as early on as the VT125. The next graphic standard they introduced let you do bitmap graphics. This standard was known as Sixel. Be careful how you pronounce that one. It was known as that because you do everything in blocks of 6 pixels. What you can do with this is actually quite impressive, and support was introduced as early on as the VT200. In fact, Xterm, the thing you probably run on your Linux desktop, and various variants of it are available for other operating systems too, that has Sixel support. Let me show you quickly here. Look, you can see you can do some quite sophisticated stuff with images. This is all just in the text terminal. This would have all just worked on a regular CRT dumb terminal. Yeah, you just install this handy utility called im2sixel, and it takes an image and spits it out in the Sixel format. I'll put a link in the comment section if anyone fancies downloading and building it and having a bit of a play. With the ability to do both text and graphics, you might wonder what could ever knock the dumb terminal off the top spot. We call that foreshadowing. That's cool, isn't it? At the same time as VAX was growing, something was simmering along in the background. VAX has what's known as a Cisc processor, a complex instruction set, which essentially has an amount of microcode that runs for every instruction that then triggers the internal instructions within the CPU. It's more complicated than that, but I'm trying to keep this brief. But by the early 80s, an alternative arrangement had appeared. Risc, reduced instruction set. And soon, every man and his dog in the computer industry was trying to come up with a Risc processor. In fact, DEC at one point had 4 separate CPUs on the go. Now, in 1985, that's when DEC decided that really it needed one Risc CPU, and one Risc CPU that would essentially replace the VAX processor in the VAX line of machines, allowing them to move VMS to a Risc platform. Now I know what you're all thinking, finally he's got round to talking about Alpha. No, I haven't. No, I'm talking about Prism. Sadly for all those working on Project Prism, it's a project that would never see the light of day. Dave Cutler had been put in charge and decided to form things up in a similar way to in which the VAX architecture was organised, in that they'd have a 2-committee structure, one committee being essentially the core Prism committee, and the other one being representing the other business interests around Prism. The problem is, by 1985, DEC had grown to be pretty big and pretty unwieldy, with groups everywhere doing different things and all wanting different things from Prism. So this meant that Project Prism went on and on and on and on. And by the time 1988 came round and Prism was sort of there, it still wasn't really ready to be put in a system yet. And DEC's Unix Workstation group, who really needed to choose a CPU, had decided to go with a MIPS-based processor instead, as they could get their machine work done in about 90 days, but it was predicted it would take over a year with Prism to get to the point where they could release a machine. So apparently in what turned out to be quite a heated board meeting, they decided that Prism was to go. This is quite unlike other CPU vendors whose zombie processors would just, well, continue on for years of abject failure until we're looking at you. Now this certainly seemed to develop a little bit of ill feeling within DEC, with Dave Cutler deciding to exit DEC at this point. It seems some DEC people use the term exit, other DEC people use the term flounce or sulk out of DEC to Microsoft. To be honest, I think it's a little unfair to say flounced out. I mean, you run a project like that and then they kill it. It's probably quite exhausting, and yeah, I could see that being quite demotivating. So yeah, it was maybe not the worst time ever for Dave Cutler to go. And of course, with Dave Cutler, a big chunk of DEC West also headed off to Microsoft with him. After the meeting where they decided to cancel Prism, Ken Olsen, DEC's founder, an all-round decent human being, approached Bob Suknick and said that Risc was still essentially a future threat to the VAX line, so he asked him to go away and have a think about what might be done to keep VAX competitive. So this led to what became known as the Riscy VAX team. One of the key realizations that this team made came from Nancy Cronenberg, and it was simply this, that customers didn't run their stuff on VAX, they ran it on VMS. VMS was the operating system that sat on top of VAX, and actually applications targeted that. So if they ported VMS to a different CPU architecture and could run the application code on top of that, well then they could change the whole processor out, so they didn't need a processor that was 100% VAX compatible. So this was the idea that was taken forwards. They would in fact reuse quite a lot of what they'd done with Prism, but it would be this Risc chip which initially came to be known as EVAX. However, management decided it needed a more neutral name, and so the name was chosen, Alpha. Yes, we finally made it to Alpha. How far into this video are we? So, a lot of the design ideas from Prism made it into Alpha, with Prism's concept of EpiCode becoming PAL code, for example. VMS was updated to support the new processor architecture, and things really started to look like they were coming together. By 1992, customers were able to lay their hands on DEC Alpha processor for the first time. And by 1994, the first line of workstations DEC produced with this processor, the Alpha Station, had started to come out too. And that's what this thing is. Yes, behold, one of the most powerful workstations available at its time. Now you may think this looks just like a fairly chunky mini tower kind of a PC, and yeah, it is going for that form factor, but there's a lot more power in this thing than, well, mini tower PC of the time. In fact, this thing could emulate a PC substantially more quickly than even the most expensive PCs at the time could actually run. I'll explain how I know that later on. Right, I think I've probably kept you waiting long enough. Let's have a little look at this workstation. Now, at the front we got this little door that covers all the drive bays. As you can see, it has the sort of things you'd expect for this point in time. We've got a 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, and we've also got a CD-ROM drive. Now, the power buttons and LEDs to tell you that it's on are also in here as well. Round the back, things look relatively similar to a PC. I mean, we got these odd interfaces up here at the top. That's where the output to our soundboard is, and also the network interface as well, or at least the connector to it. If we come down the machine, we'll see we've got a number of card slots as well, including a VGA card. Yeah, this thing just takes a normal VGA monitor. You might be wondering why I'm sounding a little bit surprised, but big Unix workstations of the time didn't just use VGA connectors. Speaking of normal connectors, we also just have a PS2 connector for the mouse and keyboard, which again, for a non-PC platform, that's not super typical, as most of them tend to use their own weird proprietary connector, at least again at this point in time. Later on, almost all Unix workstations have moved on to using VGA and regular mouse and keyboard connectors, because it's really expensive not to. Now we've had a good look at the exterior, it's time to have a little look at the interior. So let's get this case off. It just has a few of these sprung screws on, although one appears to have been snapped off. And with the side lid off, I can grab my best anti-static chopstick and start showing you around the machine. Now, as you can see, the interior of the machine is divided into 3 sections, a top, a middle and a bottom. So let's work from the bottom up and have a little look at that. Now, this is where all our PCI cards are. Yes, this thing takes regular PCI cards. It's got a number of 32-bit slots and 64-bit slots as well, so even a cheeky little ISA slot in there as well. And this meant that DEC Alpha machines could take advantage of regular PC cards. These made them a lot cheaper to own. And also, you could connect them up to a much wider variety of things this way. The only thing was, you were going to need a special driver for it, but as we'll talk about later on, that was less of an issue than you might think. Moving up from the bottom section of the machine, we'll move to the middle, and this is where all the drive bays are. So at the back, you've got these drive bays for the hard disks, and you got regular drive bays up here at the front for CD-ROM drive. I've also got another SCSI disk in there as well. Also in this section, you can see we've got routing for a number of cables as well, up to the top of the machine. And we may as well follow them up and have a look at the top of the machine. And this is where our CPU and memory lives. It's also where we get those extra little ports. See, these actually come up on these cables and provide things like sound connectors from the I/O board at the bottom. Same with the network, because all that stuff's on board the board at the bottom section of the machine. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So if we lift the machine up, you can see from the top, we can extract the board. We'll pull this out. This card essentially has in it all our CPU and memory. We'll just have a quick look around so you can see the actual Alpha processor here. There you got the memory. Now if you can see along the bottom edge, we've essentially got what look like a number of PCI card endpoints, and that's because they are. That's what carries the PCI down to the I/O board below, and they just essentially plug into a slot, and that's what gives us our PCI. And then once it's slipped back in place, you see this nice fan cowling sort of lines up with the CPU, and that gives us our CPU airflow. This is actually quite a well-engineered machine. As you can see, we've got magnetics on all the cables where we need them. They've even done a nice job of routing the audio, so the only cables that you take in and out of this thing on a regular basis, your headphones, well, there's a nice little jack point for that at the front. Yes, there's no USB though, unfortunately. Now I've got 2 operating systems installed on this thing. It can obviously hold others. The 2 OSs I've got installed are DEC's own one, so we've got VMS, which obviously we talked about a fair bit earlier, and was the operating system for the VAX clusters. So this meant you could take all your VAX software and you could just run it on Alpha under VMS. And we also have True64, which is the follow-on from DEC's Unix line, and again, this was a pretty popular thing to run on it. Now, there were other operating systems that ran on this, and we'll come on to them a bit later in the form of Linux, which eventually became a pretty big deal for Alpha, and also Windows NT. Now here we are booting up into VMS. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on VMS, because I'm not super familiar with VMS, to be honest. I was never a professional VMS admin, because by the time my career had started, VMS was, well, not considered the most up-to-date technology. Let's put it that way. And so unless you're a corporation that had a lot of VMS already, you're unlikely to suddenly pick it up the second that Alpha appeared. Now this is the part of the video I was planning on booting into True64 and showing you this version of Unix, but one small problem. The SCSI hard drive failed in the workstation. Yeah. So before I could capture this, yeah, the disk went wrong. So, if I had managed to get it to boot, what you would have seen is a very conventional version of Unix. It followed all the major standards you'd expect to see, so you'd see the common desktop environment, which I've got slides of here. I'll show that. What would have been difficult to show you, because I've only got one workstation, is True64 had a number of clustering abilities, so there was a cluster filing system available for it, which let you cluster in essentially a pretty similar way to you could on VAX. The major difference being it used much more commodity type hardware for the job. By the time Alpha came out, not all was going well for DEC. In fact, one might say there was trouble at mill. DEC had some unique problems all of its own. After years and years and masses of development costs, the VAX 9000, their mainframe competitor, had finally been brought to market. But it arrived at a point in time where, well, the mainframe was seen as going the way of the dodo. Prism itself had caused a huge delay with updating the VAX platform, and customers were beginning to wonder what was the future for VAX. And coupled with that, the rise of the microcomputer had really caused DEC some problems. If you remember earlier we talked about the terminal being DEC's bread and butter, well, the rise of the IBM PC has eroded the terminal market. Now, it's not like DEC hadn't seen this coming. It had in fact tried to get into the micro market. It had quite a few attempts of trying to get into the micro market, with things like the DEC Pro and the Rainbow and various other machines that they tried over the time. There was even a desktop version of VAX known as MicroVAX. It's not quite the same as VAX, it's got a slightly different instruction set, but it could run the VMS operating system. Unfortunately for these platforms, none of them had ever managed to gain any mass market acceptance. So for most of the early 90s, DEC had been losing money. And while Alpha had been happily turning a corner and starting to do volumes of sales, the unthinkable happened. In 1995, DEC's board decided to remove company founder Ken Olsen from post. Reading various comments from lots of different DEC employees from that period of time, and even still from today, yeah, that move was spectacularly unpopular within the company. It's hard to stress just how much the staff seemed to like Ken Olsen. It'd be fair to say that man was the heart of the company, and people just really liked him. Ken had tried to make a big difference in their lives and, well, had succeeded with things like the DEC Credit Union and creating the sort of work environments that were supportive of people who were not just, you know, single white men. So when the board let him go, yeah, it'd be fair to say there was some anger within DEC. I mean, I'll give you an example of one of the comments posted by an engineer here. It reads as following: "When the board stabbed Ken in the back, it was at that moment I realised I wasn't working for DEC anymore, but just some computer company." That gives you some idea to the strength of feeling there. I mean, phrases like stabbed in the back. That tells you just how unfairly various DEC members of staff thought Ken had been treated. It also didn't help that at that time, bits of DEC were being sold off. It was being cut up into smaller and smaller units, and various members of the board were financially doing quite nicely out of that. The staff, yeah, not so much. And that sort of thing had not been the ethos of DEC before, and was certainly not Ken's personal style. This meant DEC was losing talented staff fast. I mean, it already had been to a certain extent from the very late 80s onwards, but this really accelerated that trend. Now, I should point out, there were also problems external to DEC that the rest of the market was facing as well. I mean, it's not that surprising that in that early 90s, from 90 to 95, a lot of DEC's competitors, well, they shut down. For example, Wang went bankrupt and was gone. CDC, also likewise, gone. Prime had already gone by this point. Most of the mini-computer vendors were either being bought by someone else or just simply going bankrupt. And even IBM, the biggest computer company in the world, was losing a spectacular amount of money each year. In fact, early 90s IBM was pretty much a basket case. It only really started to turn itself around when it bought the consultancy firm Arthur Andersen and shifted what its business model was to a certain extent. All this led to the point in 1998 where DEC was eventually bought by Compaq of all companies. Yes, PC clone manufacturer Compaq had grown to the size where it could consume what was, at one point, the second largest computer company in the world. This was quite a big shock for the industry at the time. I remember people being very surprised that this was a thing. Partially, it's because people had not realised just how much smaller DEC had become, how many of its business units it had sold off, and what little of core DEC was left. Now, you may have been wondering, what's been happening to Alpha during this whole period? Well, Alpha had been getting quite successful, to be honest. It managed to gain itself a pretty unique market sector. It could be the high-end Unix station that lots of pre-existing companies that used Unix wanted. To customers who had stuck with VMS, it was the new, shiny, all-powerful platform they could run all their existing applications on. Now, while all that helped DEC keep existing customers, Alpha also attracted new customers as well. Alpha soon developed into a really interesting niche, a niche that was, well, quite profitable. Now, in this section so far, I've only mentioned operating systems that were DEC's own ones, i.e. True64 and VMS. But Alpha also had two other significant operating systems, Linux and Windows NT, both of which primarily were thought of as PC operating systems. Now, the problems for the PC platform is processing power was still relatively limited, even with top-end machines. So if your application was running out of processing power and you needed more performance, well, there weren't many places to go until Alpha arrived. With Alpha, you could run the operating system you were already familiar with, it's just there was an Alpha version of it. It installed pretty much in the same way that it did on a PC. It had PCI cards, just like a PC. It used PC-like keyboard and mouse connectors. It felt very much like, well, a PC, just a really powerful PC. This meant that normal PC users didn't need to be scared of the thing, so corporations could just, well, buy them and use them alongside their PC platforms. Because, you know, it ran the same OS. In fact, for Windows NT users, the situation was even better. So let's assume for a second it's the mid-1990s and you're working for a company that's forcing you to use Microsoft Exchange Server. Can you tell this is based on my life events? Well, your Exchange Server needs more users on it and needs to be just that little bit faster. What are you going to do? You've already topped out on the highest end PC processor there is, the machine won't let you fit any more memory, and yet this Exchange Server is struggling. The company certainly doesn't want another Exchange Server and everything that's involved with having more than one of the things. They just want somehow to magically go faster, just spend some money, please. Well, suddenly in walks DEC with Alpha, and you can get your Alpha machine, you can install NT4 Server on it, and you can install Exchange on it, and just migrate the data, and lo and behold, you have a substantially more powerful machine. And it's running what feels like all your own normal software that you'd normally use on a PC. Really, there seems to be very little difference apart from it's a little harder to get drivers. Now you may be thinking that sounds great for where you can get applications that are built for Alpha as well. And to be honest, there were vendors other than just Microsoft doing that. There was a wide variety of server-side applications available for Alpha. But even if your application did not support Alpha and was just written in x86 assembler, for example, well, you were still okay. There was a neat trick in Windows NT that let you run x86 code built for Windows NT on the Alpha version of Windows NT. Essentially, it had a dynamic recompiler that would take all your opcodes for x86 and recompile them as Alpha opcodes. It would then cache that dynamic recompilation, so it didn't have to spend the time doing it again, and well, your code would run quite quickly. In fact, your x86 code would run about twice as fast as it would do on the then top-end PC processor. And then, of course, we're going to come round to Linux. At the time where Alpha's starting to come into its stride, Linux is really taking off. It's starting to get space in the corporate data center, but also, most importantly, in the new emerging world of the internet, Linux is fast becoming the dominant operating system, at least for those providing internet services. As a Linux admin, you can quite happily use Alpha. You can take your normal PC distribution and guess what? There's an Alpha version of it. You could just install that. Any services you're running on top of that? Well, there's Alpha versions of that with the distribution. And if it's not in your distribution, you can just compile it just like you do on the PC. This meant you could happily go from having a PC-based machine, and if you needed more power, you could move on to Alpha with very little change in what you actually do. And also, you have an advantage over NT users in that you don't need drivers built for Alpha because all your drivers are in the kernel. So that piece of hardware works on the regular PC, pick it up, put it in the PCI slot in your Alpha, and it works there too. In theory, Linux users could have always just gone and used Sun hardware, for example, instead. But compared to Alpha, the world of Sun was strange and proprietary. Some were still going with their own custom buses at this point in time, even keyboard and mouse connectors were different. So Alpha seemed like a fairly, normal, safe choice in many ways. So this carved quite a nice niche market out for DEC Alpha, as essentially being the next step up from a PC for many corporate and business uses. Unfortunately for Alpha, just as it had turned this corner and hit this nice profitable niche, things went wrong in the world of Alpha. Compaq, who had recently bought DEC, was starting to run into some financial difficulties. Part of this was that cheap PC manufacturers in Taiwan and the likes were starting to eat the bottom end of Compaq's market. Then also, Dell had moved into the scene and started getting into the sort of mid-tier workstation market, and also started to push into the server market, and all the market that they were taking were mostly Compaq's market share. And then there's the acquisition of DEC itself. That had not been the cheapest thing Compaq had ever done, and Compaq were failing to kind of merge it into their normal business operations. They were essentially just two separate companies that just happened to be owned by the same people. This led to Compaq looking for a way to cut costs and reduce part of the digital part of the business. And one obvious group to look at was the Alpha group. Developing a CPU architecture is not cheap. It is an expensive thing to do. Taping out chips is not cheap. Semiconductor manufacturing, not cheap. Everything to do with a processor is not cheap. So you need a lot of sales to underpin it. And while sales were doing alright, suddenly something appeared on the horizon, and that thing was Itanium. Yes, Intel was suddenly offering a 64-bit chip, apparently, so this could become the next step up from PC, and apparently it'd also run x86 32-bit code just fine. So Compaq made the decision that it was going to bring Alpha to an end, and it would switch to using Itanium. Of course, we all now know that Itanium was a massive lemon and completely useless, and they really shouldn't have cancelled Alpha for this thing, but yeah, they didn't know that at the time. They thought probably Intel's economy of scale would mean that Alpha would eventually end up getting crushed by it. And also, Alpha's costs were things that Compaq was struggling to afford. If Compaq had realised that Itanium was going to be a complete lemon, they could have well kept Alpha going, and the world might be very different to how it is now, but no, that's not what happened. In fact, eventually Compaq itself would succumb to its own financial difficulties, eventually being bought by Hewlett-Packard. So unfortunately by this point, DEC is no more. But it did leave behind it a really interesting legacy. For example, we all still use the terminal standards it created in terms of VT100 and VT220. VMS, the operating system for VAX, that's still alive and well, amazingly. Yeah, the rights to that were sold off to another company, and they kept developing it. They moved it onto Itanium, and they're currently moving it onto x86-64. So there are still a surprising number of former VAX customers out there still running stuff on VMS to this day. The influence that their PDP range had on the whole of computing is still felt to this day. For example, the Unix operating system was created on a PDP, and versions of that still in use today. The other big thing, which we've not mentioned at all in this video up until this point, is DEC were the first licensee of ARM to do their own silicon, creating the strong ARM processor. The influence of that is still felt to this day in the ARM ecosystem. But not all of DEC's achievements were technological. Oh no, remember, this place was run by Ken Olsen, so there's some serious social achievements here as well. For example, the DEC Credit Union, an organisation that was created so staff members could get mortgages who somehow just couldn't from normal banks. Well, it still exists, it's alive and well, and there are still in fact DEC members of staff, well, former members of staff, still actually have their mortgages with the DEC Credit Union to this date. In fact, one person told me that your account number was the same as your DEC badge number, and that only changed this year. And of course, we should probably also mention Windows NT, or just Windows as it's now known. there's a lot of similarities between how Windows works and how VMS worked, because both created by the same guy, Dave Cutler. And also, the NT team had a lot of Deck West people there too. So if you made it all the way to the end, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. And it just remains for me to say, if you enjoyed the video, why not click that thumbs up button, because apparently that's helpful for YouTube algorithms and whatnot. You could also come discuss deck stuff with us in the comment section, because that seems to be quite a lot of fun from the last video. Oh, and I should mention subscribe. Yes, please do subscribe, because that really does help people find this channel and its videos.